Okay, so for section 1-2, we are going to talk about observational studies versus designed experiments. Both dogs are sleeping, so hopefully they won't cause a problem this time around. So we only have two objectives today, and they are to distinguish between an observational study and an experiment and explain the various types of observational studies. So here we go with objective number 1. We want to distinguish between an observational study and an experiment. Researchers Joachim and associates wanted to investigate cancer risk among Danish cell phone users who were followed for up to 21 years. To do so, they kept track of 420,095 people whose first cellular telephone subscription was between 1982 and 1995. In 2002, they recorded the number of people out of the 420,095 people who had a brain tumor and compared the rate of brain tumors in this group to the rate of brain tumors in the general population. They found no significant difference in the rate of brain tumors between the two groups. The researchers concluded cellular telephone was not associated with increased risk for brain tumors. Researchers Joseph Rohde and associates examined whether chronic exposure to radio frequency, RF, radiation at two common cell phone signals, 835.62 megahertz, a frequency used by analog cell phones, and 847.74 megahertz, a frequency used by digital cell phones, caused brain tumors in rats. The rats in group 1 were exposed to the analog cell phone frequency. The rats in group 2 were exposed to the digital frequency. The rats in group 3 served as controls and received no radiation. The exposure was done for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 2 years. The rats in all three groups were treated the same, except for the RF exposure. After 505 days of exposure, the researchers reported the following after analyzing the data. We found no statistical significant increases in any tumor type, including brain, liver, lung, or kidney, compared to the control group. In both studies, the goal of the research was to determine if radio frequencies from cell phones increased the risk of contracting brain tumors. Whether or not the brain cancer was contracted is called a response variable. The level of cell phone usage is the explanatory variable. In research, we wish to determine how varying the amount of an explanatory variable will affect the value of a response variable. So again, the more you use the cell phone, are you going to get the cancer or not? One would explain the other. The response variable is the focus of the question in study or the experiment. It is the variable of interest in a research study. An explanatory variable is one that explains changes into the response variable. It is any factor that can affect or explain the value of the response variable. An observational study measures the value of the response variable without attempting to influence the value of either the response or the explanatory variables. That is, in an observational study, the researcher observes the behavior of the individuals in the study without trying to influence the outcome of the study in any way, shape, or form. And observational studies can indicate a relationship, but they cannot establish causation, meaning you can't establish if one thing caused another to happen. If a researcher assigns the individual in a study to a certain group, intentionally changes the value of the explanatory variable, and then records the value of the response variable for each group, the researcher is conducting a designed experiment. That is, in a designed experiment, a treatment is applied to the individuals in a sample in order to isolate the effects of the treatment on the response variable. Only an experiment can establish causation between the explanatory variable and the response variable. Okay, so now we're going to look at a study and we're going to determine whether it was observational or designed. Researchers wanted to determine the long-term benefits of the influenza vaccine on seniors aged 65 years and older. The researchers looked at records of over 36,000 seniors for 10 years. The seniors were divided into two groups. Group 1 were seniors who chose to get the flu vaccine shot, and Group 2 were seniors who chose not to get the flu vaccine shot. After observing the seniors for 10 years, it was determined that seniors who got the flu shot are 27% less likely to be hospitalized for pneumonia or influenza and 48% less likely to die from pneumonia or influenza. Based on the results of this study, would you recommend that all seniors go out and get a flu shot? The study may have flaws, namely confounding. Confounding in a study occurs when the effects of two or more explanatory variables are not separated. Therefore, any relation that may exist between the explanatory variable and the response variable may be due to some other variables not accounted for in the study. We're going to get to what those confounding flaws might be from this study. I'll tell you one of them right now. You don't know what the underlying health conditions of any of those seniors are. The older you get, the more likely you are to have a health issue that could also affect how that vaccine is working. A lurking variable is an explanatory variable that was not considered in a study, but the effect and the value of the response variable in the study. In addition, lurking variables are typically related to an explanatory variable considered in the study. So some lurking variables in the influenza study. You could have your age, health status, or the mobility of the senior. So again, for age, just because you were a senior over a certain age, the age of 65, you might have been 67 or you could have been 97. There's a big difference in those two ages. Just spoke a couple minutes ago about health status. You don't know what the underlying conditions of them are. And again, how mobile you are is also going to affect your physical health. So even after accounting for potential lurking variables, the authors of the study concluded that getting an influenza shot is associated with a lower risk of being hospitalized or dying from influenza. Okay, it's associated with. Observational studies do not allow a researcher to claim causation, only association. Okay, so there's different types of observational studies that we're going to talk about. There's going to be 3 different types. And here are those 3. So the first type of observational study is something called a cross-sectional study. And what that does, it's an observational study that collects information about individuals at a very specific point in time, okay, or over a very short period of time. A case control study is one that's retrospective, meaning they require individuals to look back in time or require the research to look at existing records. In case control studies, individuals who have certain characteristics are matched with those that do not. And a cohort study first identifies a group of individuals to participate in the study, the cohort, and then the cohort is observed over a long period of time. Over this period, characteristics about the individuals are recorded. Because the data is collected over time, cohort studies are prospective. Okay, so now we're going to look at some different examples, and we're going to determine whether they're case-controlled, a cross-sectional, or a cohort study. And again, I know it's on the bottom of the screen. Unfortunately, I can't do anything to alleviate that with this program that I'm using. Okay, so first, we want to determine whether each of the following studies depict an observational study or an experiment. If the researchers conducted an observational study, determine the type of observational study. So for A, researchers wanted to assess the long-term psychological effects on children evacuated during World War II. They obtained a sample of 169 former evacuees and a control group of 43 people who were children during the war but were not evacuated. The subjects' mental states were evaluated using questionnaires. It was determined that the psychological well-being of the individuals was adversely affected by the evacuation. So the first thing that we need to do is decide whether it was an observational or experimental. And in this case, it's going to be an observational study. Again, you can see that on the bottom of the screen. Okay, and what type is it? It's going to be a case control study because it looked at information at a very specific point in time. It didn't ask individuals to look back or anything along those lines. So it's an observational case control study. So for part B, xylitol has proven effective in preventing dental cavities when included in food or gum. A total of 75 Peruvian children were given milk with and without xylitol and were asked to evaluate the taste of each. Overall, the children preferred the milk flavored with the xylitol. So again, if we want to know whether this is observational or designed, observational, we would have done nothing to influence it. But here, because we gave some the xylitol flavor and some without the xylitol flavor, that's a designed experiment. For part C, a total of 974 homeless women in the Los Angeles area were surveyed to determine their level of satisfaction with the health care provided by shelter clinics versus the health care provided by government clinics. The women reported greater quality satisfaction with the shelter and outreach clinics compared to the government clinics. So again, we want to know whether this was a observational study or an experiment. And again, we didn't separate the groups and give one a certain kind of healthcare and one another type of healthcare. We just asked them. We didn't influence that in any sort of way. So this is an observational study. Okay, and what we are doing here is we are looking back to determine their level of satisfaction that has been provided. So this is going to be we weren't looking back. We were looking at a very specific point in time, which means that this is going to be, so we weren't looking back. So this is going to be a cross-sectional study. Okay, and our last one, the Cancer Prevention Study 2, CPS-2, is funded and conducted by the American Cancer Society. Its goal is to examine the relationship among environmental and lifestyle factors on cancer cases by tracking approximately 1.2 million men and women. Study participants completed an initial study questionnaire in 1982, providing information on a range of lifestyle factors such as diet, alcohol, and tobacco use, occupation, medical history, and family cancer history. These data have been examined extensively in relation to cancer mortality. Vital status of study participants is updated biannually. Okay, and what that means is every other year. It's not important to the question, but just in case you were wondering what that word meant. The cause of death has been documented for over 98% of all deaths that have occurred. Mortality follow-up of the CPS-2 participants is completed through 2002 and is expected to continue for many years. Okay, so again, we didn't give one type of treatment and one not. So this is going to be an observational study. And again, in this case, it's not over a short period of time. It's not looking back. It's looking forward. So in this case, that's going to be our cohort study. Okay, and our last slide, we have a census. And a census is a list of individuals in the population along with certain characteristics of each individual. Okay, and we just did the census this past year. And again, if you were at home and mom and dad were doing it, again, it was a list of 10 questions that you had to answer. And it asked you questions such as how many people lived in your house, what the ethnicity was of each person, what the age was of each person, and what the income level of each person that's in your household were. And that's pretty much collecting information about each individual that was in your house. So that's all a census is. Okay, so when I see you in class tomorrow, we are going to do the classwork from section 1-2.